Some people claim the devil himself came to the tiny town of Villisca, Iowa that summer night in 1912, when 8 people were killed by an axe murderer. Others say the devil had been here all along. After more than a century of idle gossip and speculation about who committed the crime, some amateur sleuths now might have just figured it out. Was it the odd reverend from a neighboring town, or an elusive railroad-riding serial killer? You're listening to The Vault, a Forum Communications podcast featuring true crime and general intrigue from the upper Midwest. I'm Tracy Briggs. The tourist attractions you'll find in southern Iowa seem to make sense. In the land made famous by Grant Wood's American Gothic painting, it's fitting to find John Wayne's birthplace or those pretty covered bridges of Madison County. But in the middle of the rolling cornfields and Iowa Hawkeye logoed silos, you wouldn't expect to find what some have called one of the creepiest places in America, the Villisca Axe Murder House. The 2-story White House sits on 2nd Street. It's one of the most popular, albeit macabre, tourist attractions in the Midwest. Thousands of visitors, including many people from the Dakotas and Minnesota, come to hear the tragic tale as they walk the creaky floors once walked by a killer. Some come for a tour in broad daylight. Others pay the $428 fee to spend the night here. The sleepovers are pretty popular. They're already booked out for more than a year, with everyone from paranormal investigators to psychics to women's book clubs. Johnny Hauser, a caretaker and tour guide, says they might have a random Monday or Tuesday night open here or there if you're interested. Hauser is the first person you'll meet when you take a tour of the house. He relays the details of the axe murders with an ease reserved for neighbors sharing stories over cans of Busch Light in the driveway. Maybe that's because he lives right next door. He's an everyman expert about the horrible night the Josiah and Sarah Moore family and their 2 young house guests met their end. But he admits, after years of thinking he knew exactly who did it, in the last couple of weeks, after examining new evidence, he changed his mind. More on that later. But first, the details of what happened on June 9th and 10th, 1912, in this quiet Midwestern town. The screen door creaks as Hauser escorts tourists into what was the Moore kitchen. It looks pretty much like it did in 1912, so much so that the house earned a spot on the National Registry of Historic Places. There's an old-style icebox and a wooden wash basin and flowered dishes in the cupboard. It's probably pretty close to what Josiah Moore's brother Ross saw the morning of June 10th, 1912, when he came to check on the family after neighbors alerted him that the home looked unusually quiet. What he found was beyond words. All 8 people in the home had been brutally murdered in their sleep, bludgeoned by an axe. Here's what Hauser says.
Everybody's in bed, just like they went to sleep, and hopefully didn't know what happened. As far as the crime scene, the axe is left downstairs.
Hauser said the crime scene was full of other odd clues. Raw bacon wrapped in a dish towel was found in one bedroom, on the floor, close to part of a keychain that did not belong to the Moores. Mirrors in all 3 bedrooms where the victims slept had been covered in sheets, and the faces of the victims covered with bedclothes. It appears the killer was in the house for a while, as a plate of uneaten food sat on the table next to a bowl of bloody water where the killer was believed to have rinsed his hands. Before he left, he had drawn the shades and curtains on the windows. On the windows that didn't have shades, he hung clothing to create near total darkness in the home. Then the killer left, disappearing into the early morning hours, seemingly without a trace. The hours before the bloodied bodies were discovered appeared to be joyous ones for the Moore family. The family, which included parents 43-year-old Josiah, 40-year-old Sarah, and their children 11-year-old Herman, 10-year-old Catherine, 7-year-old Boyd, and 5-year-old Paul, had attended a Children's Day program that evening at their Presbyterian church. When it ended, around 9:30 that night, they walked home with 11-year-old Lena Stillinger and her sister, 8-year-old Ina Stillinger. They had been at the program also and were invited by their friend, Catherine Moore, to sleep over. It's presumed the group went to bed shortly after getting to the Moore home. According to the coroner, the murders probably took place shortly after midnight. The Stillinger sisters were discovered dead in a downstairs bedroom. Josiah and Sarah killed in the master bedroom, and the rest of the Moore children killed in the other upstairs bedroom. Given the unusual clues at the crime scene, today's law enforcement officials would probably have a fairly easy time finding a suspect. But back then, fingerprinting was a fairly new venture, and DNA testing, of course, unimaginable. However, the biggest issue was that the crime scene itself was not secured. Hauser said within hours of the murder, curious townspeople made their way to the Moore home, where many were allowed inside the home to gawk at the victims and trample on any potential evidence. Hauser said before the National Guard was called in to secure the scene, an estimated 1,500 nosy neighbors stopped by.
I've seen one shot of the mob scene, and its head's clear up to the school up there. It looks like a rock concert. I mean, thousands of people.
Interestingly, a local druggist who thought enough to bring a camera to the crime scene was escorted out before he had a chance to take pictures that might have been helpful to the investigation. With everyone and their grandmother visiting the crime scene that day, it's not surprising that many began to fancy themselves experts in the case. Tongues began wagging over the identity of the axe murderer. A couple of suspects topped the list right away. The first was a man named Frank Jones, a prominent Villisca resident, Iowa state senator, and former boss of Josiah Moore. Now, according to town gossip, Jones was really upset when Moore quit his job at the Jones store 2 years earlier. To add fuel to the fire, it was rumored that Moore had had an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. Some speculated that Jones, who was 57, hired another man to commit the murders. However, no credible evidence was ever found to connect Jones or the other man to the crime, and they were never arrested or charged. A more credible suspect was soon found in Reverend George Jacqueline Kelly, who residents had described as peculiar. He was a known sexual deviant who once placed an ad for a secretary with the requirement that she occasionally type in the nude. But his reputation alone wasn't enough to cast suspicion his way. That happened when an elderly couple reported seeing him board a train in the early morning hours of June 10th. The couple also claimed that he told them of the murders despite the bodies not yet being discovered. Kelly was interrogated by police, and he eventually confessed to all 8 axe murders. He was arrested in 1917. But before his trial began, he recanted his confession. To add insult to injury for the prosecution, the couple, who claimed to have been on the train with Kelly, later changed their story. With little evidence tying him to the killings, the first grand jury to hear Kelly's case hung 11-1 in favor of refusing to indict him, and a second panel freed him altogether. Now, despite Kelly being let go, many residents of Villisca, population 1,162, still believed he was guilty, and has been that way for more than 100 years. The tour guide and caretaker Hauser was one of those who believed in Kelly's guilt, until, he says, just 2 weeks ago, when he and some friends went through the interrogation transcript. He was shocked when he read it.
I realized he asked for his attorneys 17 times within 10 minutes. And then they're going, you don't need your attorneys to tell the truth.
Hauser said the police then told Kelly, you walked up to the family and did this and this and this. At first, Kelly denied it, but later said something along the lines of, well, you guys are high in stature people and you wouldn't lie. All in all, it appears Kelly's rights were violated during that interrogation. Author Bill James, in his book, The Man from the Train, The Solving of a Century-Old Serial Killer Mystery, said he does not believe Reverend Kelly was capable of committing a crime of this nature. This is what he wrote. Whoever committed these murders was a horrible person, but he was also cunning, strong, organized, and relentless. Kelly was timid, weak, and mentally disorganized at an extremely high level. When people said bad things about him during the trial, he would bury his face under his arms and sob uncontrollably. His wife, towering over him in the next chair, would cradle him like a child and pat him on the head. The title of James's book gives a clue as to who is now suspected of the murders: The Man from the Train. James and others who have recently studied the case say the murderer was likely a serial killer who traveled the railroad as early as 1900 or so looking for victims. The serial killer theory actually goes as far back as 1913, but 21st century technology has made it easier to compare each of the, what James speculates, is 100 murders committed in the immediate years surrounding the Villisca murders. In one case, a couple in Kansas, just 3 hours from Villisca, was killed by an axe murderer just 5 days before the murders in Villisca. Many of the murders studied have similarities, including they took place in a town with a railroad stop. They happened on a Sunday night. Often entire families were victimized. The killer used an axe, which he left at the scene. The victims' faces were covered after they were killed. The killer washed his hands at the scene. The killer appeared to linger at the murder scene before leaving. Now, while James and others might lean toward a serial killer being responsible for the Villisca murders, they don't necessarily agree on the name of the man responsible or if the murders were committed by more than one man. Even so, the evidence we have now is far more significant than what was compiled over the last 110 years. Will the crime ever be solved? Maybe it doesn't even matter. Whoever brutally murdered the Moores and the Stillinger sisters has long since died, never punished for the sins he committed on earth. He got away with it, but he left a mark on this tiny town in southwest Iowa, where the name Villisca might just forever be synonymous with axe murder. You've been listening to The Vault, a Forum Communications podcast covering true crime and general intrigue from the upper Midwest. Forum Communications is proud to be part of the Trust Project. Learn more at thetrustproject.org.